welcome. This is session 6 of the Global Youth Climate Training. Today we'll be learning about fossil fuel phase out, and we have an amazing range of speakers lined up. Just going to let everyone filter in. So in the meantime, if you just want to type in the chat box where you're dialing in from today, and we'll just, wait for a second and then get right into it. Cool. So I will be co-moderating.
Donc, je vais être la co-présentatrice de cette session avec Luigi aujourd'hui. Elle a déjà donné une session extraordinaire le mardi. Tu peux te présenter, Luigi, ensuite on va commencer.
Okay.
For some reason, it wasn't letting me unmute, sorry.
Désolé, j'avais mon micro éteint. Bonjour à tous. C'est vraiment super de vous retrouver aujourd'hui. J'espère que vous avez bien aimé la dernière session. Je ne vais pas rester trop longtemps pour l'introduction parce que vous avez déjà entendu l'introduction la semaine dernière. Je suis la co-responsable du TYC et de ce programme.
Back to Clarissa.
Et donc, je redonne la parole à Clarissa. Merci beaucoup, Luigi. Donc, je travaille pour Oxford Net Zero. Je viens de Nouvelle-Zélande. Nous avons des orateurs extraordinaires, notamment Alexis McGivern, que vous connaissez sûrement.
Two other amazing speakers who I'll introduce when we go through the agenda. But yeah, in terms of what we're doing today and our learning outcomes, could we just have the next slide, please? So by the end of the session, you should be able to explain the current status of fossil fuel phase out and the landscape of UNFCCC and non-state actor agreements, describe the political economy of fossil fuel expansion and phase out as it relates to development options and trajectory, and understand how we can achieve climate policy outcomes by leveraging non-climate approaches to policy. Next slide, please. So we'll start off with our remarks from our youth speaker, Moy Guiquita, who will be speaking in Spanish, and that will be translated into English. So yeah, if you're on the channel, it will translate for you. Then we've got Alexis McGivern, who you guys will be familiar with. Then we'll be going into our first round of breakout rooms to reflect on the two presentations before hearing from Professor Navrov Dubash, from Princeton University. Then we'll have our second session of breakout rooms, and then final reflections and information for next time. And yeah, Myrna has just put in the chat about the quiz, and we'll go over this again at the end, but we really want to remind you that the deadline for the first quiz is tomorrow, and that you need to complete both quizzes to get your certificate. So please try it out. It's totally accessible and you will be able to do it. The most important thing is just having a go. So please do that before tomorrow, but we'll remind you again at the end. Yeah, amazing. So I will hand over to Luigi to introduce our first speaker.
So our first speaker is Moi Guiquita. He is a super accomplished content creator with more than 6 years of experience focused on cultural preservation and the defense of the rights of nature. As an environmental and indigenous activist, he's represented his community in important international forums, such as the Climate Change Summit, COP, and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO. And through his content, Moy portrays life in the Amazon rainforest, highlighting how ancient customs can coexist with the challenges of the modern world. It's his mission to inspire new generations to connect with their roots and act in defense of the planet. I'm super excited for you, Moy, so get right in.
Okay. Espero que todos se encuentren muy bien. Muchas gracias
I hope you are all doing well. Thank you for inviting me, for having me
todos bem.
here.
Muito obrigada pelo convite e muito obrigada por me dar este espaço. Vou falar pouco de mim. Sou indígena Bogani da
Waorani
Amazônia
indigenous
do Equador.
person from
Como
the
podem ver, eu
Ecuador
estou agora
rainforest,
na
and
minha
as you
comunidade.
may see, I'm here on my community. I have internet through a satellite, and I use solar panels to live. I have needed 6 years in order to get to this point and in order to be able to show people what my life here in the rainforest is. So besides the rainforest and the fauna and flora, we do also have some small villages. And as well as that, we have some people living in more remote areas. Wherever there are indigenous peoples, there is some protection for nature and for the land. But in those places where there are not indigenous peoples, then it is more difficult to find that protection. In the Western countries, you can just drive your car to the supermarket and purchase your food and products. We do the same thing here in the rainforest, but we use our hands and our feet, our legs for that. We go and fish in the river, we hunt in the jungle, and we do also carry out different ancestral activities. We sing. And this is my favorite place. Of course, that I've been to other places, sorry, but this place is fundamental for me. This is a legacy from my family. I feel that it's been an incredible gift for me to see land as my home as well. I'm not only protecting the land and nature, but also my home. In the past 60 years, my community has had a lot of problems since fuel companies, oil companies started to settle in this area. Some mining also took place, and this led to deforestation. So multinational companies are now polluting the rainforest, and our nature is falling sick or ill. I can experience the negative consequences of human nature and greediness. This has had an impact on nature, of course, and it has consequences on different communities and peoples. I see that what we call development is having a negative impact on our communities. The indigenous people are not able to process what is happening. People come here and are really greedy about what they want to get here in the rainforest, but we live and we survive thanks to our nature, our rivers, etc. So when mining companies come here, they state that everything is legal, but they end up polluting everything. I'm lucky to be located in an area that hasn't experienced this yet. We have an alliance, a youth alliance, and also an alliance with other communities that not necessarily are indigenous peoples. But this alliance serves as a protection. As you can see, I'm in the middle of the rainforest.
Mostrar justo lo de acá atrás es como lo más real que puede
And
existir,
what you
porque
can see is the
siempre
most
estamos como
real
acostumbrados a ver
thing
como
you
los
will
edificios,
experience. In
estar
general, we
viendo
are
todo lo
used
demás, como
to
las estructuras,
seeing
pero la gente se olvida que
buildings, infrastructure,
dentro de
and
este mundo aún hay
people
espacios
forget
que
that
se
in
pueden
our
como
planet,
preservar y conservar, y
well, there are
gracias a los
still
pueblos
some
indígenas pues ha habido como
areas
esta
that
relación
can
de
be
conservación.
protected
Y entonces
and preserved.
And this has happened thanks to the indigenous peoples. A few days ago, I was lucky to meet a colleague, and he told me, Moy, I don't understand why people are still focused on preserving nature when the fuel that we use and that we produce every day is present in our daily life when we drive, when we eat. So this was a person that belonged to a company, like one of the company leaders. And I answered him that he has an Western side of this. He has the Western perspective of it. And so, based on how he grew up and what his education was, well, he's not able to see the real value of nature, of rivers, of birds chirping. You cannot experience and you cannot comprehend all the values that I inherited from my ancestors. The importance of singing to nature, for example. And so I'm trying to protect that legacy. I have tried to further communicate the importance of all these values. And right now, I'm a youth activist. And I work together with other youth allies. This is a gift that I inherited from my father, from my grandfather, from my whole family. My family has lived here for hundreds of years. This has always been our home, and we will continue fighting in order to protect our home. We know that it is based on our practices, on our education, that we can continue growing, and we are going to do so based on love and peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. It was wonderful to hear your words, and thank you for being here with us. You're welcome to stay for the rest of the session and join in. It's up to you. I don't know what you're up to later in the day.
Thank you for being so inspiring as well. I know that while I was listening to you, I was really, really inspired. I'm sure everyone else and all of the youth were as well. So keep on doing what you're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Muy bien, Moy. Ese es el mensaje. Qué lindo escucharte, hermano.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Moy. Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. So I'd just like to notify everyone that we are going to have to change around some of the session timings. We will no longer be able to do the breakout room in the middle. So we're going to go straight from Alexis into our next speaker, and we'll be having a longer breakout room at the end. So hopefully that's all right with everyone. We're just resharing the agenda now to make that clear. But yeah, just digest that, and then we will move on to our next speaker, the amazing Alexis McGivern, who will be familiar to you all, I'm sure. So Alexis is the Net Zero Integrity Manager at Oxford Net Zero, an interdisciplinary research group based at the University of Oxford. She works to translate academic research on net zero into guidance for corporations, civil society, policymakers, and the standard community on credible action to reach net zero by 2050. She works to strengthen the integrity of net zero targets, including through addressing justice and equity concerns of net zero. As you know, Alexis co-created and directs the Global Youth Climate Training Programme, which we're doing now. This is a collaboration between Oxford and the Global Youth Coalition to train young climate change makers. She co-chairs the Race to Zero Professional Services Providers Working Group, convening a diverse group of stakeholders to better define what high integrity net zero looks like for PSPs like law firms and consultancies. And prior to working on issues of climate change, Alexis worked for several years at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on issues of conserving marine biodiversity. So today, Alexis is going to speak about how to assess the fossil fuel sector's commitment to net zero, and she's also going to summarize recent international and non-state action on fossil fuel phase-out. So I'll hand over now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Clarissa, and it's really lovely to be with you all today. And I'm sorry about the shift in breakout rooms. That was my error for not putting the right session order before I left and went on leave. So I'm just coming to you all now from near Vancouver. This is my first time in 8 years visiting my family in Canada. So it's 5:30 in the morning, and I couldn't be happier to be all here together with you all, talking about the fossil fuel sector's commitment to net zero. So really excited to be with you all today. So what will we cover today? We will cover kind of situating the status quo on fossil fuels, what they, how they sit within the global climate ecosystem. We'll cover the gaps and inconsistencies in fossil fuel companies' approach to net zero. And then we'll finish with non-state actor leadership and ambition on fossil fuel phase out. And why is this important? Why is this worth covering in this session? Well, you'll understand how to cut through the sort of inconsistencies and greenwash in fossil fuel messaging. And I hope next time you'll see an advertisement from Shell or BP or Exxon, you'll be able to really situate that understanding within their climate commitments. And then be prepared to engage in this debate at COP29. This was a really live debate at COP28. It will be probably less so at COP29 just because of the focus on finance this year, but still fossil fuels are the looming context within which we operate at all of the COPs. So let's get started. So just as a reminder, what makes a good net zero target? You might remember this from my presentation last week on net zero governance. And just as a reminder, a simple acronym to score net zero strategy. So we want short-term plans and targets. We want, if you have a commitment to net zero by 2050, that you have an idea of what that means for 2025, for 2030, 2035, and so on. We want short-term plans that are achievable, just as when you're setting any goal. If you say, I want to run a marathon in a year's time, you need to be training for that and not just show up on the day without any planning. We want coverage across all greenhouse gases and scopes, offsetting used very scarcely and with very specific conditions, such as geological storage. We want reporting and accountability, so transparency is really key, and we want equity for workers, communities, and more to be, and sort of global impacts to be considered. So, situating the status quo on fossil fuels. So my key message for you, if you can remember in this section, is that the fossil fuel industry is a highly subsidized and unconstrained industry that is expanding despite very strong directives from experts all around the world to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And the interesting thing about fossil fuel phase out is that it brings in all sorts of discussions about equity and about who should phase out first. Because, of course, as we know, fossil fuels make up 80% of our energy use right now, and that phase out will have both huge benefits, but also costs in the short term. So who should go first? So the global public subsidies for fossil fuels almost doubled to $700 billion in 2021, and that's from the International Energy Agency. And if you include what we call implicit subsidies, so that's all of the kind of cost of climate change and air pollution damage, we're basically subsidizing with public money the fossil fuel industry to continue by absorbing all of their negative externalities. There's also a massive lack of supply side regulation. So we split fossil fuels into supply side and demand side. So supply side is everything to do with the supply of fossil fuels. And they are very politically unpopular because no government wants to be the one that kind of cuts off the legs of a highly lucrative industry in their country. And so we see a very strong lack of supply side regulation. And then we also see a context of massive planned expansion. And so most major oil and gas producers are planning on increasing production out to 2030 and beyond, far beyond our ability to meet climate targets. So if you haven't read it already, I really recommend checking out the Production Gap Report. This is a report that comes out, I think, every other year. And it basically looks at the planned fossil fuel extraction globally. It's a really, really fantastic report, a very depressing report, but important to have a transparency and understanding. And so we see that governments worldwide are planning to produce 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And as we know from the session a few sessions ago, 1.5 degrees is our temperature limit that has been embedded into the Paris Agreement. And what's interesting about the Production Gap Report is that we see who the main culprits are, and they are some of the richest countries in the world. The United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, where I sit now. These are the countries that are expanding most aggressively and have the most capacity to transition fastest. So we see a real inequity there in terms of fossil fuel production and planned production. And what we face with fossil fuels is the energy trilemma. We're trying to ensure that everyone has access to energy, because access to energy means access to light, to read, to go to school, to cook, to be able to learn. And energy just creates all the meets all the needs that we have as a human society. But we see a real disconnect between the energy use, especially in the global north and in global majority or global south countries. So what we want is energy that is affordable, primarily, reliable and sustainable. And sometimes hitting the three parts of the energy trilemma is really difficult, and especially difficult on different timescales. We probably could meet all of these if we had 20 more years to roll out slowly all of the energy, renewable energy needs that we could provide. But now we're in a phase where we need to rapidly ramp up the amount of renewables and rapidly ramp down the amount of fossil fuels. So one of the biggest myths, or kind of, I wouldn't say myths, but sort of dominant narratives that come in when it comes to fossil fuels is that fossil fuels are the very best pathway we have for the much needed and urgent development goals to be met. And this is a very legitimate concern. There are urgent development concerns that should be met. But I would argue that and many experts would also argue that shouldn't happen at the hands of oil and gas majors. These are largely multinational corporations that are aggressively expanding oil and gas expansion, but they are not necessarily benefiting or even reaching the people in the countries where they are extracted. So, for example, some really great analysis from PowerShift Africa, which, if you don't know them, are an excellent kind of think tank and engagement organization based in Kenya, but working across the African continent about basically shifting the energy systems within the African continent. And they had a report last year that was released at COP that said that 60% of the projected production in Africa between now and 2050 is owned by multinationals that are headquartered outside of the continent. And there are cases like the East African crude oil pipeline, where that being a partnership between Total and I actually forget the kind of non-MNC companies, but they are largely going to export that oil and be used in Europe. So it's African oil being exported to be used in Europe, but the narrative is that we are expanding for energy security on the African continent. So it's really important to be live to these issues of manipulation by the media and really understanding who that energy is going to be used by and who will bear the cost of expanding fossil fuels. The other really big narrative that we see, especially in the United Kingdom, which is, as I mentioned, one of the 5 top countries in the world that will be expanding fossil fuels, is that fossil fuel expansion is the most necessary for energy security. This is something that we've been hearing a lot since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and since the global energy dynamics have shifted quite dramatically, that aggressive fossil fuel expansion is the only way to ensure pensioners in their homes will not freeze over winter. That is a really common messaging in the United Kingdom, that people need warmth, need energy for heating and eating, as it said. But actually, in the same way that we are exporting lots of African oil and gas, we're doing that in the United Kingdom as well. We're really aggressively expanding in the United Kingdom, but also we're expanding about 80% of UK oil production, for example. And that's a statistic from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, so the government's own analysis, which showed that we're exporting so much of our oil, and yet the energy security myth was used as a kind of the dominant narrative to expand and issue new licenses, predominantly last year and this year. Oh, sorry, I think my slides are a bit out of order. Oh no, sorry. These are just a handful of kind of what experts are saying on fossil fuel phase out. So Fatih Birol, who's the International Energy Agency's executive director, said, if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal from this year. The UN Secretary Antonio Guterres, who is really aggressive on fossil fuels in a way that we haven't really seen in the UN Secretary General before, and highly appreciated. But he has a lot of, I don't know if it's him or his comms people, have very good kind of lines on fossil fuels, but just said fossil fuels are a dead end for our planet, for our humanity, and yes, for our economies. And then last year, Antonio Guterres appointed a high-level expert group, basically to create recommendations for what a legitimate non-state actor commitment to net zero looks like. So if you remember the presentation that I gave you the other day about net zero governance, a lot of those key criteria come from Antonio Guterres' high-level expert group. And one of the bits that they put into that report, which civil society were very pleased with, was that non-state actors cannot claim to be net zero while continuing to invest in new fossil fuel supply. So thinking about the positionality of non-state actors in really cutting off the fossil fuel industry. And what's interesting about the sort of economic argument on fossil fuel phase out is that my colleagues at Oxford have done a really kind of explosive paper that was making the rounds a lot last year, which showed that transitioning to a clean energy system is cheaper than a slow or no transition pathway, and that green technology costs have fallen dramatically and that are going to continue falling. And so we're also choosing a pathway that is cheaper, more reliable, and just better for our planet, which is just sort of a triple win as we look towards fossil fuel phase out. So mentioned on the second bullet point, I wanted to walk through some of the gaps and inconsistencies in fossil fuel messaging. So I have 4 areas. There are lots more, but I have 4 key areas. And the first is on the actual versus pledge spending on the transition. Second, on sunset.
الموارد المالية الحقيقية والتي تم الاتفاق عليها.
Interpreter, I think you've been taken out of the interpretation room. Fred, can you help us out with pushing her back in? I think, yeah, I think she's back in. Alexis, you can go ahead.
Nice. Okay, cool. Thanks. Perfect. So the second is on sunset dates, third on scope 3 inclusion, and last on intensity targets. So actual versus planned spending on the transition. This is, I think I mentioned it last time because it's like one of my favorite papers that came out. I think it was 2022. And it was basically looking at the clean energy claims mismatch between BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell, and looking at the increase in sort of rhetoric on getting to net zero versus actual spending. And the bar chart is from the IEA, and it looks at the distribution of cash spending by the oil and gas industry. So the blue, which makes up the kind of majority of the light blue, which makes up the majority of the graph, is oil and gas kind of capital expenditure spending on extracting oil and gas. And then the green is buybacks to shareholders. And then you can see, if you can see my cursor, the very, very small dark blue on this bar and this bar is low carbon capital expenditure. So that's spending by the oil majors on renewable energy rollout. And so one thing that was really nice about that paper was that the industry average spend on renewables by the industry was less than 1%, between 0.5 and 0.8% on their clean energy spending versus their total capital expenditure. And so Equinor, for example, who is a Norwegian, the Norwegian state-owned oil company, or doing trying to get an oil field, trying to expand on an oil field in the United Kingdom, in Scotland. 99.87% of their spending was on oil and gas and 0.13 on renewable. And yet they're kind of putting themselves as this savior, and that they are the pathway to energy security and to renewables. Sunset dates. So sunset dates have this unintentional impact of accelerating exploration until the sunset date. So if you put a sunset date on an oil and gas field that you can no longer extract after 2030, you would think that kind of helps us phase out, which it does at the date of 2030. But what it does mean is that there's a massive ramp up in trying to make sure you can extract all the possible oil and gas you can until that date. So sunset dates can sometimes have an unintentional impact of really accelerating oil and gas production in the short term. Scope 3 emissions, this is something that we spoke about the other day. Scope 3 emissions are the emissions that are not controlled by the entity itself. So in the case of oil and gas, that would be, for example, the emissions from combusting a combustion engine. If I drive a car when I've purchased the oil from, purchased the gas from Shell. And that, as you can see in the fossil fuel industry, makes up a huge proportion of emissions. But many net zero targets set by the fossil fuel industries completely exclude scope 3 emissions, which means that you're kind of excluding about 80 to 95% of your total emissions, which means you have an incomplete target. And I had one about intensity targets, but I remembered that Kaya had covered that, which is basically setting absolute targets, which is reducing at an absolute level, versus intensity targets, which means getting the same amount of oil out with just fewer carbon emissions. And what's interesting about that is that the oil and gas industry, we often center carbon in that discussion, but the oil and gas industry, as we know, causes many more impacts than just carbon in the atmosphere. There are human rights violations, biodiversity loss, land rights violations, and those things cannot really just be encompassed by looking at carbon in and out. So international and non-state action on fossil fuels. So there's been a real increase in non-state actor-led or encouraged campaigns on fossil fuel phase-out. So just to give a bit of context, COP27 was quite a disappointing ending and left us with very watered down language on fossil fuels, which was a phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which, what is an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy? That's a good question, because it actually hasn't been defined within the Paris Agreement or within the UNFCCC more broadly. Whereas COP28 delivered us this paragraph 28, which is on energy, which is the right direction, but definitely not strong enough. So energy outcomes were basically in this paragraph 28. And Augustine, I remember really clearly sitting with you in the venue, looking at a text that was released right before this version of the text, and literally crying over what they had put in the text, which was a similar watered down phase out of unabated coal or something lame. And we then had basically in the last 24 hours this result in this last kind of paragraph 28. And the most important bit is this paragraph 28D, which was the language that ended up in the global stocktake, which is transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. And there's other, pieces of this paragraph 28, but one of the things that civil society were frustrated about was that there wasn't a direct language that said phase out fossil fuels by this date. But because there are so many different interests in context in the room, we landed on this one, which gives us seeds a good direction for fossil fuel phase out, but isn't quite strong enough. So there were also some non-negotiated outcomes. So there's always the negotiated and then non-negotiated outcomes. So there was this sort of double down, triple up, which was double down on energy efficiency and triple up renewables. And the sort of unmentioned thing was phase out. The global cooling pledge was to reduce emissions from cooling. So kind of air conditioning and that kind of stuff. And then the climate health ministerial, which was the first time there had been such a ministerial on climate and health. But what was interesting is that it was the health impacts of climate change rather than the health connections to the fossil fuel industry, the kind of health impacts of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels actually weren't mentioned that much in the climate health ministerial, or maybe at all. So I just wanted to, in closing, just go through some of the non-state actor alliances that are working to advance fossil fuel phase out. So there's the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which the US and Colombia joined last year or this year, I can't actually remember. And there's been strong leadership from sub-state governments. For example, there's a Polish province of Wielkopolska, which was one of the most coal-dependent provinces in Poland that joined after the eastern part of the province was a member for the past 2 years. And so the Powering Past Coal Alliance is kind of a success story on coal and has helped get some more ambitious language on coal into kind of wider international agreements, although there's criticisms of the PPCA that we might have time to go into on Slack or something. And then the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance is the international coalition of governments and stakeholders that basically manage the phase out of oil and gas production. And at COP28, Spain, Kenya, and Samoa joined. So they're seeing increasing traction with BOGA, and especially the launch of the BOGA Fund, which was supporting Kenya and Colombia in their just transition plans. And then finally, and if you go back to the recordings from last year, we had someone from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty speak last year, it's basically a large civil society effort to accelerate the expansion of renewable energy and equitably phase out production of fossil fuels. And this is many countries, a lot of island nations, and then at COP28, Colombia joined, which was is still the largest fossil fuel producer in the treaty. But there are also academics and Nobel laureates and others who are endorsing the treaty, and it's really kind of a popular culture moment in speaking about and naming fossil fuel phase out as the key ask. So I'm a bit over, so I'll just say the key takeaways is that the fossil fuel industry needs demand side and supply side policy to get to net zero. So we say cutting with both arms of the scissors. And to date, they have not followed through on their net zero strategies, and we need mobilizing from both consumers of fossil fuels and also, which is the majority of the world, and also civil society and policymakers to take a stand. And we have both the capacity and co-benefits to move to a decarbonized energy system, but we need leadership and policy to improve large procurement of clean energy. And that's it. I don't know if I have a final. Yes, I don't have a final slide. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your presentation, Alexis, and for such a comprehensive overview. We're gonna do a quick 5-minute Q&A with you before we introduce our next speaker, Navros. So Luigi will facilitate the Q&A, and then I will introduce our next speaker. So are you all good to go on the Q&A?
I'm all good to go. Okay, so
Awesome.
the first question for you is, what do you mean by fossil fuel expansion?
Yeah, so by fossil fuel expansion, I mean granting licenses for exploration, so for discovering oil and gas, but also for exploiting that oil and gas, so pulling out of the ground and then being able to transport it to be burned and used for energy.
Okay, the second question is, energy decision-making is especially opaque due to massive financial interests. What successful strategies and best practices do you know of that can put pressure on fossil fuel companies short of blowing up pipelines?
That's a really good question. And it's one that I would really, oh God, that's like the $1 million question if we knew if we knew that really well. I think one thing that works well with governments, and this is what Navros is just about to speak on, is really emphasizing the co-benefits and making sure that there's a fair pathway to phase out. So one of the main holdbacks at COP28 was the language on phase out was basically, sorry, it's so early in the morning, my brain is still a little bit fried. One of the main barriers to getting really strong phase-out language at COP28 was that a lot of countries, especially in global majority or global south countries, were saying if we don't get the requisite finance, it's not fair for you to impose phase out on us without giving us the support we need, especially because the only reason why we're phasing out now is because now we have a better understanding of climate, but nothing has changed in terms of our energy needs and our development needs. And so I think one of the things is making sure that there's a clear funded pathway to make sure that global north countries, instead of spending on their own expansion, are spending on equitable energy access for all, which is maybe not something that will happen in the very short term, but I think is something that is increasingly happening, of taking responsibility to fund and finance energy transitions. And so we see things like just energy transition partnerships and other kind of large-scale multilateral development banks who are financing based on some criteria that include fossil fuel phase out. So, but it's true that the fossil fuel industry has its tendrils in absolutely everywhere, in places that you wouldn't quite expect. And we see that with a number of fossil fuel industry lobbyists in UNFCCC spaces. And so it's really difficult. And part of you mentioned kind of, short of blowing up pipelines, I would say there's a really important spectrum there, from direct action, direct activism, all the way through to making sure they are in the room with policymakers as they're making those decisions. And so, there's lots of people doing great work on fossil fuel phase out. Some of those that I mentioned in my presentation, but it's a really tough question to be able to, it's a bit of a David and Goliath situation. But we are the people, and we are more people, and with people power, I really think you can overcome if we have this narrative shift on what fossil fuel phase out would mean for our health, for our environment, for our economies, and really controlling that.
So for time, we're gonna take just one more question. You have like a ton of questions, but I'll like choose one. How can we ensure that a just transition that protects vulnerable communities and how can we ensure that we have a just transition that protects vulnerable communities and workers while phasing out fossil fuels?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I would say one way that we kind of are framing the just transition is that the transition will happen. We will need to phase out fossil fuels, either by choice or by being forced into it, because it's becoming more and more infeasible to phase out fossil fuels. And so the fossil fuel industry says that they're protecting workers by making sure that they can expand. But actually what they're doing is just pushing out the date at which that it will no longer be feasible for them to actually work. And that's especially true, for example, in the UK, there's a really live debate over jobs and job security and how many jobs will be lost by a transition to renewable energy. But actually, we know that the basin, for example, in the North Sea is already declining. And so those jobs are going to be lost anyways. And if we don't manage that into a phase of retraining people, making sure that they have jobs, making sure that they have opportunities, and making sure that those communities are supported, then we'll see a phase out that we don't control. And so in the UK, we've already seen a phase out of coal. The UK used to be a massive coal country, and a lot of the communities that were where coal plants were shut down were absolutely abandoned and left without any kind of support. And they're now some of the most deprived areas in the country. And what we want to see now is that the areas that are rely on oil and gas globally don't become those kind of those areas that are just forgotten or left behind. And so it's really about adequate financing, adequate training, making sure that we're not putting our heads in the sand and pretending like the phase out won't happen if we just don't speak of it, and really making sure that we're taking people along a journey that they have 20 years to really get on board to a new energy system. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alexis. That was an amazing presentation, and it was lovely to have you even when you're on leave. Your determination and you're conscious around climate stuff is really inspiring to see.
Thanks both. It's really great to see you guys.
Really
I'm
great.
excited for Navroz's presentation.
Yeah. Okay. For our next speaker, we have Professor Navros Duvash, and he is a professor of public and international affairs at Princeton University and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. His research explores emergent patterns of climate governance suitable to meet the twin challenges of the climate crisis and unmet development aspirations. He previously worked in India for 15 years at the Center of Policy Research and Sustainable Futures Collaborative, which he co-founded. He has advised the government of India over the last decade as a member of advisory committees on climate change, energy and air, and water policy. And he's also coordinated a team to draft India's long-term low emissions development strategy. Early in his career, he helped establish the Global Climate Action Network as its first international coordinator. Navroz has contributed extensively to climate and energy research over 25 years, serving on the IPCC, most recently as coordinating lead author for the 6th assessment report, and as a member of the steering committee for the UNEP emissions gap report. He's currently co-editor-in-chief of climate policy, and we're excited to hear from him today about the links between climate and developmental outcomes and the evolving landscape of climate policy. Navroz, that's like an amazing biography, and really excited to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you so very much. It was far too long an introduction, but very generous. So thank you. Can I just to ask the AV folks, can you see my pointer if I wiggle it around, or you cannot, right? Oh, you can? Okay, good. All right, great. Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have a chance to chat with this group. And also really pleased to follow Alexis. I think that was a great presentation on fossil fuels and phase down questions, etc. You know, what I'm going to try and do today is, in a sense, step back a little bit and provide a bit of context as to why this transition is so challenging. And I think implicitly might even get to some of the questions that Alexis didn't have time to get to in the comments. What I want to do is talk about climate change as a multiple objective challenge, and particularly focus a little bit more on what it looks like from the global south, from the developing world. And why is that? So next slide, please. Why is that a useful thing to do, right? And the way I like to tell the story is, if you look at the top left corner here, so sorry, whose arrow are we seeing? Are we seeing my arrow at this point?
Yes, we can see your.
Okay, great. So if you look at the top left graph, it's basically just a population projection graph, right? And it essentially says that right now at around 2025, about 80% of the world is in Asia, Africa, and South America. And that that share is just going to grow, right? So in this period, when we have to decarbonize from now to 2050 and then on into the end of the century, the people have to be convinced that their interests are aligned with decarbonization and climate resilient development. Most of them are going to live in the developing world. And what are we going to ask them to do? If you look at this graph on the right, here's the IEA's different modeling trajectories. So as you go from blue to green, it's more stringent scenarios. You can see that the advanced economies are on a glide path towards net zero, whereas the emerging market and developing economies essentially have to do this kind of hairpin bend from increasing emissions to rapidly decreasing emissions. That's the nature of the challenge, right? To actually provide more energy needs while decarbonizing at the same time. So just in terms of the relative angle of shift, it is literally a U-turn. It's like a hairpin turn. And so the bringing that about is challenging in all kinds of ways, because the nature of the structural economic changes, the social changes, the infrastructure changes are just bigger in a sort of, and this image gives you a sense of why that is, right? Okay. How are you going to do this? I don't want to in any way argue that there is one trajectory. In fact, quite the contrary. So if you go to the next slide, what I want to argue is that context matters a great deal for both the developed and developing world. And these are not sort of big buckets that we can, big discrete buckets, right? There's actually a spectrum, and that's what this graph tries to show you. There are different starting points across the world. So sorry for this very complicated graph. The IPCC specializes in them, and I've used a few of them. But essentially, the story is not that complex. Along the bottom here on the x-axis, you have Human Development Index, which basically runs from 0 to 1. So it's the level, it's a basket of indicators that tell you about social and economic development together. And along the y-axis here, you have emissions per capita, emissions per person, right? And then the size of the bubble is the total size of emissions for that region. Essentially, everybody needs to get down into this bottom right corner where you have high levels of social development and low levels of emissions per person. African countries, which are in the gray, countries from the continent of Africa, essentially have to move horizontally in this graph. Some of the developed world has to move essentially vertically. They more or less have achieved human development. They need to decrease their emissions. Countries in East Asia have to move in both directions. They have to decrease their emissions, but they have to increase their human development. So the starting point is very different for all of these countries. In some cases, as in Africa and parts of South Asia, energy needs are still growing. So as I said, we have to decarbonize while developing. Okay, what are other aspects of context? Next slide, please. So this is a really nice study on Africa, particularly focused on fossil fuel transitions, which is the subject for today, right? And what it basically says is different countries in Africa are likely to have different transition pathways based on whether or not they have a high renewable share right now versus a high fossil fuel share, which is the y-axis, and what time frame in which they should be thinking about this transition. So if you look at South Africa, right, they basically are locked into a relatively high fossil share. And the question is, what is the relative trajectory? This is kind of the envelope of trajectories from which they would get to a low carbon share. Ethiopia is substantially hydro dependent, and so its trajectories, in a sense, doesn't have to pass through fossil fuels. Mozambique has a lot of fossil resources it hasn't exploited. It could choose to exploit them, or it could choose to tunnel through, right? So your technology starting point matters, your resource base matters, and you have different choices based on factors such as these. Next slide. Basically what I'm trying to do here is take you through the various factors that go into how a country makes these decisions and how it tells a story about a low carbon pathway that is also convincing in terms of development, right? Yet another factor is capacity, right? This is some research that we did, which basically says, we did an analysis of how many people in the government of India, and India is a large emerging economy. It has aspirations to being a world power. It's certainly what we would call a middle power. And a few years ago, we filed right to information requests. And essentially what we found out is, in terms of permanent staff across the government of India, a total of 62 people spread among these ministries work on climate change, right? 62 people. It's not a very large number for the scale, and this is the central government. Obviously, there are more at states, but it's not a very large number for the scale of the problem, right? And even if you look at the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, it's 10 people. Now, there are a lot of other consultants and seconded people and so on and so forth. But this is a very thin definition of capacity, but it's an important definition of capacity, just the number of warm bodies. It's a good proxy for how much attention is being brought to bear on this, given the range of other issues that have to be dealt with. So developing countries are frequently trying to make these complex transitions with overburdened administrations. Next slide. And not least, geography and vulnerabilities matter, right? So this graph is just an IPCC figure on which parts of the world are more vulnerable. So you can see that it's the developing countries, big parts of Africa, Asia, that are going to be more vulnerable. Higher shades of or deeper shades of red are more vulnerable. And so just trying to put this together, right? You have different starting points, low energy use, low levels of capacity, already feeling the impacts of climate change, and this steep hairpin bend of how you make a fossil fuel transition, right? I don't want to actually sound that pessimistic because, in fact, a lot of aspects of this transition, as Alexis noted, are also coterminous with development. A lot of the things you would want to do to address these changes will also get you development. More sustainable cities, for example, and I'll come to that in a minute. Better public transport systems, reduced air pollution. But designing, so even though we know there's a better place out there, getting from point A to point B is a really complicated task. And not least, it requires shifting the way we talk about climate change and development and the politics around it. So next slide, please. Here are a few ways in which people do talk about it, right? So the first one here is the old school climate equity view, which is still resonates very strongly and has reason, right? Which is that the North substantially caused the problem, the South didn't. Why should we have to do much and do it so fast and take such a big share of the burden? And I think the answer is that there is no pathway to development left that is innocent of climate change, which is not to say that it's easy, right? And one way to, in fact, take the politics forward is this big cartoon down here, which is kind of a co-benefits cartoon, right? Which is that, yes, there are all these other good things that could happen that are, as I said, synergistic with climate change. And that is probably the way to build a political narrative in the developing world. And then the top right is a sort of dark humor take on the fact that, people keep talking about the economic costs. And actually, the economic costs of real climate change are probably going to be so large that they will dwarf the costs of any adjustment that we make. So there's kind of equity politics, co-benefit politics, and existential politics. And in different countries, different combinations of those things will work. So I guess where I'm coming from is to say, look, there are good reasons to bring climate change and development together, but the fact that there is a version out there where these things reinforce each other doesn't mean that the transition is going to be easy. There are lots of things, such as addressing more capacity, such as addressing finance, that are going to be necessary to make that transition possible, right? So it's a mixed bag story. We have to do this. It can lead to a better world, but there's lots of work to be done. There's lots of concrete, tangible things that currently get in the way, not least of which is convincing that this enormous share of the world's population, that our interests lie in addressing these two things together. Okay, so hopefully I've made that point reasonably convincingly. But let me move on to, in a sense, the second part of the story, which is what do you do about it and how do you do something about it? Okay, so next slide. What I want to take you through now is, given this complexity, what does climate policy making look like? How do you start thinking about policies? And, can one size fit all? Because for too long in the history of sort of climate policy, there has been a prescription, the language of best practice, that this worked in country X, let's move it to country Y, plug and play and off we go. And I really resist that framing, which is not to say that everybody has to reinvent the wheel. There are things to learn, but you have to adapt the learning to particular contexts for the reasons I just gave, right? So when you're starting out as a climate policymaker, I think there are at least two questions. There are multiple questions, but for the sake of simplification, two particular questions I want to get into today. What objective are you seeking to meet? Or objectives are you seeking to meet? So clearly we have to have emissions reduction as a primary objective, as a key objective. That's the point of the exercise. But is it okay to say that emissions reduction is the only objective? And the problem with saying that is that in many countries, I would argue, certainly in the global South and also in the global North, you don't have political buy-in for emphasizing emissions above other objectives, above economic security, above energy security, above clean air, above healthcare, and so on and so forth, right? And opinion polls show this. Climate, qua climate, is rising up the agenda for people, but it's not at the top in all countries, certainly not at the top in most countries in the developing world. You have to find a way of telling the story that brings together objectives. What are the other things that are important? Energy access, particularly in African nations. Air pollution reduction in much of South Asia. Job creation around the world, north and south, right? Livable cities. We have cities that are increasingly congested and unlivable. So how do you package these things and how do you design your policy in ways that hits multiple buttons? Second, once you have a sense of your objectives, how do you match that to policy, right? Now, this is very crudely put, but there's two broad ways in the literature of thinking about it and in the practice. One is, how do you shift incentives? How do you get businesses, individuals, others to change what they're doing at a particular point in time? So the typical levers you pull are pricing levers, regulation levers, information levers, and so on. The other way of thinking about it is, this is a long game. We want to induce a transition over time. So you want to lay the groundwork for a transition that's yet to come. And that's kind of where the just transition language comes from, but there are other ways, other transitions I'll talk about, okay? So if you take these two, next slide, please, you can end up with a nice 4-box diagram. I'm sorry, in my formatting, the boxes don't actually show up, but you have to visualize the boxes here, right? So in terms of the objectives, enhancing mitigation, which is an emissions objective, versus addressing multiple objectives, shifting incentives, price, and individual instruments, versus enabling a transition, thinking about a pathway and inducing shifts along that pathway, right? So maybe now let's start populating this. Next slide. So if you look at the top left, right, this is what most climate policy has been in the past. It's a direct focus on mitigation. How do you squeeze emissions? How do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And so the kinds of things people talk about are carbon taxes, cap and trade. So you put a tax on carbon at a national level. Cap and trade is this idea that you basically say you have a national limit on carbon. You then allocate that carbon to different businesses and different entities. And then anybody that is able to reduce it more than their allotment can sell the surplus to those who could reduce less than their allotment, right? And what you find is that a whole mix of measures have been found to be useful. This graph down here from the IPCC lists the kinds of things that have been tried, and it increasingly shows that across the board, there have been more efforts in sector after sector, electricity and heat, industry. All of these curves are rising, right? We're seeing more and more efforts. Interestingly, though, when it comes to pricing, while there has been more pricing, right now, or a few years ago, about 20% of global emissions were covered by a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, so by a price. 20% is not that big a number, and that doesn't take into account the fact that the price is probably lower than it should be. So, pricing is part of the mix, but right now, we're not in a place where pricing of carbon, which many people talk about, is a silver bullet that's going to drive these changes, okay? So this is much of the academic writing, much of the policy writing for the last 10 or 15 years has been focused in a sense on this box. But what's become interesting is the spread to the other boxes, the sort of broadening of the conversation, which takes us back to this multiple objective way of thinking about things. So let me go to the next slide. Okay, so the other way of thinking about it is to say, all right, we're not going to win political buy-in from just emissions. We need to bring some other benefits along, right? So co-benefits, as I said, realizing mitigation development synergies. So you might define co-benefits as development actions that provide climate gains or climate actions that provide development gains. So you see the point here, right? Different countries can actually market their policies in different ways. So India, for example, had a solar energy promotion policy back in 2010. Internally, it was sold as an energy security measure. right? Because we were importing lots of oil, because we were importing some coal, we had low quality coal, but internationally it was sold as a climate measure. I have no problem with that. Politics is the art of the possible, right? So we have multiple objectives we're trying to hit, and we're going to try and shape things in ways that make sense. A good example of a co-benefits approach is improved public transport, right? Indian cities, for example, are choking with traffic. If you improve public transport, you get more livable cities, you get better air pollution, and you get climate gains, right? These are the kinds of things that can win support. What's interesting about co-benefits, and in fact, all three of the remaining buckets, is that you typically can't have just one policy instrument. It's not just about a price or about a regulation. It's actually about combining them in useful ways, and that will come up more clearly in the next example. Okay, next slide. So the next one is really more focused on emissions, but in a sense, emissions trajectories on rails, right? So it's not one point in time. It's how do you induce a shift over time? And the idea here is that we have new technologies like electric vehicles, like renewable energy coming down the pike. And how do you smooth the pathway for their adoption? The way in which this gets talked about a lot is through these so-called S-curves, right? So the S-curve basically says, okay, this is along the x-axis is the amount of is the progress towards adoption, but along the y-axis is actually how much you're displacing the existing technology. And what's interesting about this is that for a long period, for about a third of the trajectory, you're not seeing much action on the ground. You're not seeing the number of solar panels, the number of EVs on the road increasing that much, but you're still making progress, right? And then suddenly you get to the point of commercial viability beyond emergence, and you get rapid diffusion. And I would argue that EVs are close to that point. Renewable energy is well into this part of the curve. And then you basically get kind of this long-term reconfiguration of the economy around the new technology. So if you look at electric vehicles, you have to get commercial viability. Then you basically have to get charging stations in place. Then you'll see a process where behavior has to change. People are willing to accept the new technology. And then you end up in a place where the new technology entirely displaces the old. What's interesting about this is that this is a technical transition. It's also a political one. So when it comes to a fossil fuel phase out, you have all sorts of interests that are embedded around fossil fuels that have to be displaced. And so your policies are not just renewable energy promotion. You might actually take a regulatory stick and whack the fossil fuel industry on the head a little bit, or certainly remove some of the things that favor it, like fossil fuel subsidies, right? So it's a deliberate effort at moving an economy and a society and a polity towards this sort of transition. So these are hard things to design, right? These are hard things to design, take a lot of capability, but it's about shifting a whole technology, a socio-technical system from one point to another, right? To the point where it becomes self-reinforcing. Let's get the last slide, and I know I'm out of time, so let me quickly wrap up with this in the next slide. I am out of time, right? Just about. Yes.
You could quickly wrap up. We're all good.
Yes. Okay, great. So the last box is, in a sense, the most ambitious, but perhaps the most salient to developing economies, right? Which says it's not just about particular technologies, but it's about whole systems that have to change. How do you urbanize, right? So again, I'm going to use an example from India. Some estimates say that some 50 or 60% of India's buildings are yet to be built. It's a huge opportunity to build your buildings in carbon-friendly ways, right? To build building envelopes that require less air conditioning for cooling, where you have openable windows, you have shade, et cetera, right? You have thicker walls for insulation to keep cool in and heat out. These are all things that are an opportunity to lock in a low carbon future and lock out a high carbon future. What's very trendy these days is green industrial policy. And that's a big term for a very simple thing, which is, given that you have growing populations, given that you have to create jobs, can you try and systematically make sure those jobs are green jobs by growing green industry? It's an easy thing to say. It's a very hard thing to do because it involves reconfiguring your economy to be competitive in new ways, right? So fossil fuel transition is something we all want to achieve, but that means finding new jobs in economies that have fossil fuels in green industries, right? Which often means more skilled jobs, more technologically capable jobs. It means being part of global complex value chains in producing these green technologies. And a big question for developing countries is, how do we end up not being just the raw material providers? How do we move up the value chain where we're getting some economic gains for our economy? Again, packages of policies help, very complicated to do, right? So this is the sort of challenge for the developing world, but it's also the challenge for everybody. What is climate policy can't be put in a box anymore. Climate policy is broader economic policy, it's broader urbanization policy, it's broader social transition policy. So the scope is really expanded. So last slide, I want to leave you with just a few messages. So this is just, you know, the whole piece put together. Let's go to the final slide. So what do I want to leave you with? Achieving climate outcomes may also require developing and demonstrating a pathway towards non-climate or development outcomes. I don't like the term non-climate because if the non-climate increasingly becomes the basis for climate policy, why draw the distinction? And I think they're actually, it's about multiple objectives really that I think we should be talking about. National contexts matter. I think I've made that point adequately. I won't go through it anymore. And the fact that there are multiple pathways to effective climate policy making. And what this means for the subject of this panel in terms of fossil fuel phase out, it means if you actively want to phase out fossil fuels, it means you have to have complementary policies phasing in other things. You have to think about development policies around things like cities and job creation. It's a whole ensemble of things you have to pull together that involves tailoring your objectives to local contexts and winning support for that message, combining policies into packages, and thinking very deliberately about inducing transitions over time. So look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Navroz. That was a really insightful presentation. I really liked how you phrased it at the end, that climate policy can't be put in a box anymore, and that this word non-climate, you can't disconnect the social and environmental issues. So we have a few questions for you, but we are running out of time in the session, so we're going to have to try and be a bit speedy so we can enable people to discuss in breakout rooms. First question. There is now quite a body of research on the job creation potential of greening economies. From your expertise, is this evidence sufficient to support political lobbying? And if not, how could these arguments be strengthened to better support different development objectives? Long question, I know.
Well, look, I think that there is sufficient evidence that green energy transition is inevitable. And therefore, there's sufficient evidence that the competitiveness of an economy lies increasingly in being part of that. What is less clear is whether an individual economy is well placed to jump on that bandwagon. China is the only economy that has convincingly demonstrated that it is out ahead of the pack. For every other economy, it is less clear whether they can have enough of a piece of the pie to create jobs for their citizens. I think that's the big question for country after country, trying to figure out what's our niche. Very few countries can capture the full spectrum like China can, perhaps the US can. So it's a question of developing niches and being part of supply value chains in order to develop those jobs.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. And I've got a link question that's just come up in the chat, which is, I've heard policymakers complain of lack of funding and prior commitments to push for new initiatives. What policies are the highest priorities or most effective in these liquidity-strapped conditions?
Yeah. So I think the funding question is really, really tricky, right? So I come at it two ways. One, there is undoubtedly so the renewable energy transition is a capital intensive transition. What's different about renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy is that fossil fuel energy, a lot of the cost comes in buying the fuel, and so it's operating cost over time. Renewable energy, there's no fuel, but you have a much higher capital cost, right? So you need to be able to finance that upfront cost. You need to build infrastructure like transmission lines and so on and so forth, right? So there is a capital intensity to it, and most of that, a big share of that requirement is in the developing world where that infrastructure hasn't been built, but the cost of capital is higher in the developing world for various reasons. So bringing down the risk of that capital is a big part of the story, right? But we don't see a story where private capital sees this as a good bet just yet. So I actually think there's a flip side to the story, which is if as a global South policy, if I was a global South policymaker, I would be focused on developing incredibly credible policies that have a better chance of attracting finance. Now, some people say, why should the onus be on the developing world? From an equity point of view, it shouldn't. But the reality is, public taxpayers in the North are unlikely to suddenly get generous, right? They're worried about their domestic circumstances. So in our own enlightened self-interest, we need to figure out ways of financing those transitions. Last thing I'll say very briefly is there's a good bit that you can do that doesn't rely on finance too, which is behavioral change, urbanization patterns, public planning, and so on. And those things are no-brainers.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sure all our audience members are really grateful to you for joining today, for your presentation and your answers. So we have just about 10 to 15 minutes left for breakout rooms now. So we'll be opening those up shortly. I'm sure you've all got a lot to discuss. Navroz, you're free to join and pop into the breakout rooms or head off as you please.
And thank you so much, Navroz, for your presentation. I especially love the point about being specific to national contexts. I think that that's super, super important. Thank you so much.
Great. I'll put in a few replies to the questions we didn't get a chance to in the chat. So I'll stay on and do that.
Awesome. Thank
you
so
very much for inviting me.
No, thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure. For the breakout rooms, everyone, we will open them up now. As usual, you'll have the 4 squares and then you can click and select the language breakout room you want to join. But we can also place you in a breakout room if you're having trouble. But yeah, we will open